Desert Storm 2 Back to Baghdad. The game arrived in stores just 6 months after the 2003 invasion and still during the violent occupation. This time around, it appeared as though war games might catch up with the war itself.
The Allied unit. We are a friendly ground unit requesting immediate assistance.
In 2004, a group of military retirees formed a game company to do just that. The result was the online subscription game Kuma War. The game at first appeared to be an average first-person shooter, but the minds behind Kuma War had bigger plans. CEO Keith Halper made these intentions clear. What we are trying to do is be a news organization.
From the headlines to the front lines, we put you there.
The game reconstructs television war events so that they can be played in 3D just days after they air. These missions have included the killing of Saddam Hussein's 2 sons, Uday and Qusay, and a raid on Fallujah, an insurgent stronghold.
Real world games. Subscribe to Kuma War, and each month you'll get playable missions delivered to your computer. Intense episodic play based on the very same stories rocking the world today.
Players are briefed before the mission with actual news clippings, words of advice from real military officers, and encouragement from game programmers.
Understand a world in crisis. After we report it, you play it in single player and multiplayer. You devise the tactics. You make the hard choices.
Kuma War illustrates the logical direction of embedded war coverage. In a sense, the game provides an embeddedness even the reporter cannot offer.
You are the 4th Infantry Division capturing Saddam. You are the 10th Mountain Division hunting Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. Wherever the war takes our forces, we'll put you there.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jackie Schechner, and this is Kuma War. When 4 U.S. civilian contractors were murdered and their bodies publicly mutilated in Fallujah last March, U.S. Marines...
Kuma War goes out of its way to take on the visual cues of television news. This game demo purportedly features real Marines playing Kuma War characters. Notice the 24-hour news channel type crawl at the bottom of the screen. The camera following these troops is, of course, the Kuma embedded reporter. War games have always been with us in some form, but what is new is that games are merging with TV news and real-world events in unprecedented ways. If it is true that games have caught up with the wars themselves, what does it mean that Kuma War has designed a game involving the U.S. invasion of Iran even before the event?
This right here, our first picture, is of Stephanie Achapinti. She is with, the heavy picture. She's with the 173rd Airborne in northern Iraq, and her father says that he is very proud of his daughter and the troops, and he wants Stephanie to know that even though he is not in Iraq, to comfort her that God will protect her and keep her safe.
Perhaps the biggest roadblock to an otherwise smooth-running TV war is the visibility of domestic dissent. Initial dissent often comes from those making the biggest sacrifices, the families of military men and women. In fact, it was this kind of dissent that accounted for the so-called Vietnam Syndrome. Because dissent was largely viewed by policymakers as a kind of national disease, a massive dose of therapy was in order. Beginning in the first Gulf War, a dominant story has been one of exemplary families who have learned to channel their anxiety toward coping.
And we'll take you live to Fort Stewart, Georgia to meet a sergeant with the 3rd Infantry Division. How are families coping as that unit gets ready to deploy?
In this new year, there's now a new reality. Duty calls again.
This is different than all the other times because you don't know when you're coming home.
What many of these families say they do know is this: this mission and their sacrifice is worth it.
If they don't solve it now, it's just going to get worse, and I'd rather make it safe for kids to grow up now than, not knowing.
Apart from the example of coping families, this therapeutic message can be heard in a variety of contexts.
Just be a proud mom and not a nervous mom. I love you all very much. Please be safe and don't worry about me. I'm happy to be where I am. This is my contribution.
Hidden from view amidst these therapeutic messages are not only the dead and wounded, but also military families who find the war to be unjustified. The organization Military Families Speak Out, for example, represented over 3,000 such families in 2003. But these stories of dissent are deemed not fit for a screen filled with coping families and happy homecomings. Not only are we given ways to cope, but also a few stern warnings. We are told that families who want their sons and daughters to be brought home could, in reality, be the ones putting them in danger.
My son's letter is just one example of many of how opposition at this point hurts their morale.
The Cranes believe anti-war sentiment at home is a constitutional right, but
I would ask, first of all, that they be mindful of the consequence, because it may be my son's or any of the other soldiers' death.
In this way, supporting the troops is made synonymous with supporting the war. Those who disagree with the decision to send soldiers to war are thus identified with the enemy. This is done through a variety of associations.
The pictures tell a disturbing story. On the eve of possible war with Iraq, it appears that anti-American sentiment is...
Worldwide, protesters are characterized as anti-U.S. or, in this case, pro-Saddam.
Many with anti-U.S. posters in English. In Jordan, police clashed with pro-Saddam demonstrators in Amman, the capital. And in Gaza, large anti-U.S. protests today, despite President Bush's new calls for a Palestinian state.
On February 15, 2003, 14 million people in 600 cities took to the streets in the largest day of protest in world history. The event was largely invisible on the news in the U.S. When it did appear, CNN associated the event with a march organized by Saddam Hussein.
1 million people took to the streets of Rome as hundreds of thousands more turned out in other capitals across Europe. Meanwhile, in Baghdad, Iraqi officials presided over a demonstration in support of Saddam Hussein. In separate rallies,
instead of an entity advocating peaceful alternatives, demonstrators are woven into the dominant story of conflict. The war abroad is thus extended to a war on protesters at home. This framing of dissent makes the most sense in combination with images of protester violence, the preferred television image of dissent. Any peaceful message appears secondary to the dominant story of conflict, if it appears at all.
San Francisco's protests turned violent last night as marchers hurled rocks and bottles at police.
Everybody clear to the sidewalk now.
And as the day's largest anti-war protest in the United States continued in New York, multiple arrests were made as protesters refused to go home.
In this framing, police are to protesters as soldiers are to the enemy. Dissent thus becomes synonymous with criminal activity.
This one hauled off by his hair, shouting anti-war outrage all the way to the slammer.
Stop killing children!
Images of long-haired, shrieking protesters fit the narrative of criminality best. And the implication is that this anger, this deviant rage, is directed at the troops fighting abroad.
Our boys are over in Iraq, and they see this, and it brings the morale down. I think the morale has to be up.
Let's talk about the ones here in the United States. Are they going to encourage Saddam Hussein to fight harder? Are they encourage his own people to fight harder? Joe, what are the exact consequences? Go through them.
Let me tell you something.
Run through them.
I'm running through them. Saddam Hussein is being helped by the protesters on the streets here and in Europe.
This framing divides the world into two: the president, troops, and supporters of the war on one side, and on the other side, Saddam Hussein, protesters, and other criminals.
Thanks, Grant. Her son's fighting in the war overseas, and tonight a mother in Brooklyn is fighting her own war in her neighborhood against vandals. Marvin Scott is live tonight in Park Slope with more on this. Marvin.
This repeated framing of dissent sometimes provokes some strange responses.
One guy in Portland, Oregon, burning a peace flag. He says he supports the U.S. war with Iraq to oust Saddam Hussein. This is his answer to war protesters in Portland.
Beyond criminalization, images of dissent, if aired at all, are diffused in other ways. Here, CNN's Aaron Brown feels the need to apologize for showing pictures